The afternoon sun bathed the streets of New York in a reddish-orange hue. J. Jonah Jameson walked home wearing a thick coat and a fedora that covered part of his face. His steps were firm, but his thoughts were much heavier than his footsteps.
A newspaper vendor greeted him warmly. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Jameson." But Jonah only muttered a quiet, Inside his head, he was composing his philosophy of life. He liked facts, simple truths, even if they were often dirty and messy. Conversely, he felt sick every time someone tried to force a falsehood down his throat.
Upon entering the lobby of his apartment building, the doorman greeted him enthusiastically. "I know that look. Working on something big, huh, Mr. J?" Again, Jonah only replied with a brief grunt. His mind drifted to the latest rumors circulating. The news that Spider-Man was going on a rampage, becoming more savage, and returning to being a menace to society. That was something he could almost believe and accept. However, as he passed through the hallway toward his unit, a female neighbor carrying a dog tried to engage him. "Make time for the little people, Jonah. We always need a fourth for canasta." Jonah walked past without a word. His focus was fixed on one thing that he found nonsensical: the rumor that Peter Parker had cut ties with everyone who cared about him, including Aunt May. Jonah opened his apartment door, took off his hat, and thought hard. To him, the rumor about Peter Parker was too much, a bridge too far. His journalistic instinct rebelled. He wanted to know which con artist was trying to sell him that nonsense story. But as he stepped deeper into his silent living room, an unexpected voice broke the silence.
"Sorry to intrude, Jonah," said the voice from the darkness.
Jonah was startled, his eyes widening in shock as he stared at the figure before him. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, realizing that his quiet evening had just turned into something far more complicated. Jonah turned fully, ready to berate whoever dared to break into his apartment. But the words caught in his throat. The sight before him surpassed all the madness he usually dealt with. In his armchair, bathed in the fading afternoon sunlight through the window, sat the figure of Spider-Man. But the mask had been removed. The face behind it was not the face of the young hero he loathed, but the face of a middle-aged man who was battered, bloody, and covered in bruises.
"Can we talk?" The man's voice sounded hoarse, fragile, and desperate. I have no one else."
Jonah stared sharply, trying to process what he was seeing. Instead of immediately screaming about the identity or the costume, Jonah's possessive instinct kicked in first. With a cold and flat tone, he pointed at his desk.
"That's my chair." "Yes, sorry about the blood. I'll clean it. Or you can burn it, and I'll buy you a new chair that doesn't smell of cigars and depression."
The atmosphere tensed. Jonah stepped closer, realizing that the man before him was fully aware of Jonah's confusion. "You have questions," the man said. "So many," Jonah cut in quickly. "But at the top of the list?" Their faces were now close. Jonah looked directly into the man's eyes, recognizing the figure behind the Spider-Man costume, the hero's arch-nemesis, who somehow was now wearing his enemy's skin. "Have you lost your mind again, Norman?" Jonah pressed, saying the name Norman Osborn with an emphasis full of suspicion. Norman stared back with an expression that was hard to interpret, a mix of mental exhaustion and despair. "I was actually hoping you could help me confirm that, Jonah." While tension peaked in Jameson's luxury apartment, far beneath the city surface, inside a smelly and dark sewer, a horror tragedy was unfolding. The sound of splashing water echoed in the concrete tunnel. Someone was running. No, something was running. It was Phil Urich. The narrative of his life spun in his chaotic head. Once he was a human, a proud son, a knight. He had even been the feared Goblin King. But those memories felt like ancient history, or maybe they just happened last Tuesday.
Time no longer had meaning for Phil. His brain was now nothing more than undead flesh, trapped in a constant cycle of decay and resurrection. His sanity was long gone, replaced by the pure instinct of a wounded creature. However, amidst his mental ruin, one thing still functioned perfectly: fear. Behind him, a mechanical whirring sound and clinking metal footsteps approached rapidly. A spider slayer, a spider-shaped hunter robot, was chasing him. The robot was small, agile, and designed for one purpose: to hunt its target without mercy. Phil looked back with a gruesome face. Half of it was destroyed, revealing raw red flesh and bone, remnants of a brutal previous battle. His remaining eye widened wildly. The remnants of his consciousness might not be able to process complex logic, but his instinct screamed loud. He understood the danger threatening him from behind. He knew he couldn't fight. The only choice for this former Goblin King was run. In a dark corner of the sewer, Phil Urich's escape reached a dead end. As the Spider Slayer extended its mechanical legs and unleashed sharp, spinning saw blades, something in Phil's rotting brain finally snapped completely. He no longer screamed. He didn't beg. Instead, he laughed. The laughter was not one of happiness, but hysterical laughter at the absurdity of his fate. A former king, now cornered like a rat, laughing at a cosmic joke that only he understood. Schwift! The laughter was cut short instantly by the sound of metal slicing through flesh. A red flash filled his vision as the Spider Slayer's blades worked with terrifying efficiency. There was no epic battle, only a cold and swift execution. Pieces of Phil's body, hands that once held power, and a head that once wore a goblin crown, were thrown into the air and fell with a pathetic plop into the murky sewage water. However, the curse of his goblin physiology wasn't over. Phil's severed head, floating on the dirty water, still held a final shred of consciousness to utter one closing sarcastic complaint. "That's not funny. Ow!" Hovering calmly over Urich's remains, the Spider Slayer finished its task. From a speaker or internal communicator, the controller's voice sounded cold, emotionless, as if reading weather data.
That was Urich. All benchmarks secure in the green zone.
For the controller, this brutal death was merely a trial run, a data statistic. Let's ramp up the game for a stress test. Who's next? The atmosphere shifted drastically. From the dark and smelly sewer tunnel, we moved to a brightly lit, modern office space at Rand Enterprises. Behind her desk, Dr. Mira Osmani Milton sat with anxiety hidden behind her professional face. Her mind was racing, not about financial reports or deadlines, but about one dangerous name: Norman Osborn. Of all people, her inner thoughts screamed, what was I thinking? I really need to fire my therapist. Her fingers moved quickly on her phone screen, sending a message to someone saved under the name The Boy. A brief conversation of a protective mother or guardian. How are you feeling? Good. Get out. You have school tomorrow. She tried to restrain herself, tried to remain professional. Suddenly, the room door opened. In walked a figure looking very out of place, wearing a bright yellow hazmat, anti-biohazard suit, complete with a gas mask in hand. It was Brian Naring. Instead of panicking, Brian posed with full confidence. "I know no one can fill out a hazmat suit as good as I do," he joked, with a ridiculously proud tone. Myra snorted, a thin smile finally etching onto her tense face. All right, I needed that. What's going on? Brian began to explain with the typical enthusiasm of an excited mad scientist. He was going to run the first trial of Mycoteria tonight, tinkering with a new fungal strand and a replica of Peter's artificial support. What can I say? I'm a passionate man of science. Want to watch? Offered Brian.
However, Myra's smile faded upon hearing their coworker's name mentioned. Her focus sharpened again.
Where is Parker? Myra asked.
Brian looked a bit offended, his scientific ego bruised. This is about my fungal strand, and yes, that sounds sexy. Peter is on the mechanical engineering part of it. Myra didn't want to hear excuses. She cut the conversation firmly. She wanted Peter Parker present.
Tomorrow, then. I want him there, even for the early stages, ordered Myra while looking back at her phone, ignoring Brian's charm.
Brian stood stiffly, a bit disappointed that his hazmat suit reveal didn't go as planned. But I'm already wearing the suit, he mumbled.
And? Replied Myra coldly, without looking back.
The tension in the Rand Enterprises lab was no longer about science, but about ego. Brian Naring, ready for battle in his hazmat suit, didn't accept being dismissed so easily. To him, wearing the suit meant it's time for action, not time to be told to go home.
However, Dr. Myra Osmani Milton was not in the mood to entertain her colleagues' whining. She put on her white coat with quick, decisive movements.
Brian, I'm already dealing with one problem child, Myra said sharply, referring to the mysterious text message she had just received. Don't be the second.
Brian wouldn't back down. He felt unappreciated. I've been here 5 years, Doc. Pete's been here 5 minutes, he protested, trying to compare himself to Peter Parker. He insisted his biological samples were ready for testing.
The debate heated up as Myra walked away while checking her phone. Your entitlement is showing, sneered Brian.
Myra retorted without looking back. I'm the best biologist in this building.
You are the best, admitted Brian, but that doesn't make you a manager who is...
Brian's sentence was cut off by the sound of Myra's phone notification. Beat.
Myra's expression changed. The message was clearly more important than Brian's ego. Damn it, this kid, she muttered softly. Her mind had already drifted elsewhere, perhaps to the figure she called the boy earlier.
She ended the conversation unilaterally. Tomorrow, she ordered briefly. Brian gaped. Tomorrow what?
Myra turned briefly, her gaze cold and sharp. Your experiment, this discussion, tomorrow, she asserted. Brian tried to interrupt with but, yet Myra immediately cut him off with a pointed personal attack.
Social cues, Naring. Learn them.
Myra walked out of the room, leaving Brian standing stiffly alone in the lab. From the hallway, Myra's voice was heard delivering a final verdict that echoed bitterly.
You're losing the plot. Brian could only stand silent with a sour face, defeated by his brilliant but secretive manager.
Back in the quiet apartment, the initial tension had subsided, replaced by a melancholic atmosphere, dampened by alcohol. Jonah and Norman sat opposite each other, each clutching a short glass of amber liquid.
Jonah broke the silence with the most human question. Did you tell May?
Norman stared at his glass, his face looking old and weary beneath the mask that had been removed. She doesn't really like me, he admitted quietly.
Norman continued with a bitter tone, trying to string together words to explain a situation that sounded crazy, even by their world's standards. Besides, a clone impersonated your nephew because he had vanished from the face of the earth. That sentence doesn't sound convincing, does it?
Jonah listened, trying to digest the madness. However, his journalistic instinct was still bothered by one striking visual detail. He pointed at the red and blue costume worn by his arch-nemesis.
If you wanted to fill the void of an idiot in tight spandex, weren't you formerly the gilded goblin or whatever? Asked Jonah sarcastically. Why all this?
That is the million-dollar question. The atmosphere turned very serious. Norman was no longer speaking as a former villain or a mad businessman, but as a man wrestling with his feelings toward Peter Parker.
We both hated him, said Norman, reflecting on their long, complicated history with Spider-Man. We both have been trusted allies.
Then Norman said something that Jonah might never have dared to admit openly, something that breached the boundaries of their high egos.
And forgive me if this sounds presumptuous. I believe we both have loved him like a son, as best as men like us could.
Jonah fell silent, his face stiff. Those words struck right at the heart of his defenses.
But Norman continued with a blank gaze full of questions. I never understood him. Do you understand him?
Jonah didn't answer. There were only silent ellipses in his speech bubble. The question hung in the air, forcing Jonah to confront the truth that perhaps they never truly knew Peter Parker as deeply as they thought.
The night grew later in Jameson's apartment. The whiskey in their glasses was no longer just a drink, but a truth serum, forcing these two old men to face the cracked mirrors of their own souls.
Answering Norman's previous question about whether he understood Peter, Jonah finally answered honestly.
No, not really, Jonah admitted, his voice heavy. Considering all the hell we put him through, and we gave him more than a fair share.
Jonah stared at the amber liquid in his glass, contemplating Peter's nonsensical mental resilience. Peter never gave up on the possibility that we could be better.
The word better hung in the air. For Norman, the word had a strange religious resonance. Better, Norman muttered. Saved? Redeemed.
Jonah raised his glass, an ironic toast to their former enemy's naivety. Even when his naivety is baffling, hope springs eternal. We are better men for knowing him, that is for sure.
However, Norman wasn't as optimistic. He stared at his glass with deep doubt. Really?
Then the true confession began. Norman put his cards on the table. He recounted what happened when he realized another Spider-Man was roaming around, Ben Reilly.
When I realized Ben Reilly was pretending to be Peter, I spent a week watching him, Norman recounted, his eyes distant. When it was clear that Ben was just playing house, I did not deploy my vast resources to find Peter.
Instead of looking for his missing son, Norman's ego took over.
I made a suit and tried to replace him, Norman admitted with a tone of self-disgust. At best, I am just a selfish fool. Norman's face hardened, the shadow of his past as the Green Goblin seeming to loom over his now unmasked face.
At worst, this is a psychotic fixation, most likely both.
Jonah stared at Norman, not with fear, but with brutal realism. He didn't let Norman drown in self-pity.
You think Peter doesn't know what a mess you are, Norman? Jonah shot back point blank.
Between the skyscrapers, the Spider team moved in tight formation. They glided through the night wind, hunting one target, Norman Osborn.
Silk, Cindy Moon led with high alertness, looking back while swinging. Maybe he saw us, Spidey, she whispered over the comms, worried their element of surprise was lost.
Beside her, Miles Morales denied it with confidence, perhaps a bit of denial to cover the trauma of the previous battle. No one saw us, asserted Miles. If Norman saw us, do you think he'd be shy after the beating he gave us? No way, Silk. Miles reminded them of the bitter reality. In the last encounter, Norman was the one who won, not them.
However, the team dynamic wasn't entirely harmonious. Aranya, Anya Karazhan, and Ghost Spider, Gwen Stacy, were involved in a clash of egos.
I was going to make a move, Aranya. I wanted my record clean, exclaimed Gwen, still feeling the need to prove herself. Little Spider Boy, Bailey Briggs, swinging at the lowest position, tried to be a wise mediator. We're all on the same team, Gwen.
A team I saved, retorted Gwen sharply, not wanting to lose.
They landed on a building rooftop with perfect superhero style. Miles had just set foot down, ready to give the next command, when that heroic tension shattered apart.
Clang!
The roof access door was slammed open loudly. Miles flinched in surprise. What the hell?
It wasn't a supervillain appearing, not Norman Osborn on his goblin glider.
Appearing was Kintsugi, a hero in cracked gold and white armor. He stumbled out the door, his body limp, breathing heavily like someone who just ran a marathon without preparation.
Spiders! Hey! He greeted, between broken breaths.
Kintsugi bent over, clutching his knees, trying to scoop up as much oxygen as possible. He stared at the spider people standing tall, without a drop of sweat, with a look of amazement and envy.
Sorry, Kintsugi said, while pointing weakly at the door behind him. That was a lot of stairs.
He looked at Miles and the others.
Oh God, you guys are really in amazing shape. Sorry.
On the roof, the tension hadn't subsided. Silk was still overcome with paranoia, looking this way and that. "No one saw us?" she asked, ensuring the perimeter was secure.
However, their biggest security threat right now wasn't an enemy, but social awkwardness. Behind Silk, Kintsugi was still trying to normalize his breathing, interrupting the serious moment with a hoarse voice.
"Not safe here, guys," he admonished, while holding his knees.
After finally being able to stand upright, Kintsugi introduced himself with good intentions that were unfortunately based on totally wrong information.
"Kintsugi, I'm here to help," he said earnestly. "I've been watching you guys sweep Osborne's place for hours. To protect him, right? Me too."
Miles Morales gaped behind his mask. He pointed at himself in confusion. "Protect him? Norman Osborn?"
Kintsugi nodded enthusiastically, feeling they were on the same wavelength. "Yeah, someone tried to kill him with a Slayer bot or whatever. I helped Spider-Man destroy it." Kintsugi added a crucial detail, the old one, obviously. Kintsugi then looked at them with an innocent gaze, wondering why they looked confused. "He didn't brief you guys? Like, at the Spider HQ table or whatever?" Miles answered flatly, crushing Kintsugi's wild imagination. "We don't have that."
Kintsugi's face fell in disappointment. Oh, that's disappointing. I assumed you guys had a cool web-shaped table. He was still trying to process. Didn't Spider-Man tell you guys to protect Osborn? Realizing that this new kid truly didn't know who he was dealing with, Miles sighed deeply. He invited Kintsugi to sit on the edge of the roof like a big brother about to give life advice.
"Come sit down before you pass out," invited Miles gently but firmly. "We need to straighten a few things out about Mr. Osborn." While the men and Spider-Boy dealt with complicated hero politics, in the background, Ghost Spider, Gwen, and Aranya, Anya, were involved in whispers that were far more personal.
"Do we like this new kid?" asked Gwen with a teasing tone.
Anya, whose cheeks seemed slightly flushed behind her mask, figuratively, tried to dodge. "Why do you ask me?"
Gwen shot straight for the bullseye. "Because you're blushing and Silk is too old."
Hearing that conversation, Spider-Boy standing between them could only roll his eyes in disgust.
"Girl talk. Gross," he grumbled. In the wealthy Upper East Side neighborhood, Dr. Myrna Saldana was known for having a successful therapy practice. She served Manhattan's elite, listening to their dark secrets while satisfying their need to feel special.
However, the clinic's tranquility was shattered into pieces.
Boom! The clinic wall exploded. Smoke and debris flew. In the midst of the chaos, the doctor's true identity was revealed. She wasn't just an ordinary therapist.
Before, she used another name, another job. She was Dr. Ashley Kafkawand, the Queen Goblin.
Standing tall in black and gold armor, complete with a crown, Queen Goblin looked more annoyed by the interruption than afraid of the explosion. She was in the middle of an interesting session.
"I've been listening to the two of them whine about her husband's affair for almost a year," she complained, while wiping blood, maybe her client's, from her face. That was just getting good.
However, her attacker didn't care about the client's domestic drama. A mechanical arm, similar to the one that slaughtered Phil Urich, shot in through the smoke, ready to strike.
A cold voice from the robot's communicator sounded again, delivering a verdict with a cruel medical metaphor.
"The bill has come due, Dr. Kafka, and insurance won't cover it."
Instead of panicking, Kafka stared at the threat with a defiant smirk. She recognized this kind of game.
Cheeky, she commented casually, as a laser beam began to aim at her face. Who are you? Wait, don't tell me.
The battle erupted amidst the ruins of the clinic. The Spider Slayer moved with deadly speed, firing lasers and slashing with its mechanical arms. However, the robot's controller seemed more interested in insulting his opponent than just killing her.
Show me, the voice challenged, as Queen Goblin tried to use her hypnotic powers.
Queen Goblin's attempt was in vain. The robot controller laughed mockingly. You'll find your goblin gaze very useless. Not stopping there, he also hurled biting literary criticism at Kafka's supervillain name. A tragic name, by the way. That alliteration is so 20th century.
Queen Goblin leaped away nimbly, deflecting the attack with a cynical smile. Funny, she replied.
However, amidst the roar of engines and explosions, Queen Goblin caught a familiar voice frequency from the robot, something that made her pause and think.
I know that voice, she said, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. What game are you playing?
The question was answered with a brutal insult. The controller didn't consider Queen Goblin a worthy opponent, let alone a main player in his plan.
Game, darling. The robot charged forward, its shadow swallowing Kafka's figure. You're not even the undercard.
Jonah stood with his back to Norman, staring at the New York City skyline from his apartment window. He pondered the nature of the costumed heroes he had criticized all this time, and, ironically, secretly admired. Of all the psychopaths knitting fancy pajamas and intending to make the world a better place, Jonah began his analysis with his signature cynical yet sharp style. He offered rare praise. Captain America is the best who ever did it, period. However, Jonah turned slightly, Peter Parker is the second best, and he did it while going through puberty, which is a huge plus.
But that praise came with a harsh warning about the reality of Peter's life. But the price he has to pay for that underappreciated achievement is becoming a perpetual screw-up, continued Jonah brutally.
Jonah turned fully to face Norman, laying out the list of Peter Parker's life ruins. He wrecked career after career, blew up his own relationships. Hell, he put his favorite aunt in the hospital more times than I can count. All because, somewhere in this godforsaken city, a stranger needed his help.
Jonah then pointed at Norman, connecting the dots between Peter's suffering and what Norman was experiencing right now. You've made a suit. You've gone out and done good, in your own way, and you wonder why you feel like you're losing your mind.
Jonah smiled crookedly, offering the most ironic congratulations in their history.
Congratulations, Norman. You now know exactly what it feels like to be Spider-Man.
Jonah ended his monologue with one key difference in how Peter handled this insane pressure. But instead of brooding or questioning his sanity, Peter makes jokes.
Hearing that, Norman looked down, a small, bitter smile etched on his bruised face. He knew exactly what Jonah meant.
Stupid, annoying jokes, Norman muttered softly.
After the brutal analysis of what it means to be Spider-Man, there was silence for a moment. Jonah raised his glass, offering a toast that summarized the entire essence of their conversation, an acknowledgement of their failures and flawed humanity.
To perpetual screw-ups, said Jonah.
Norman clinked his glass with Jonas. Amen, he answered briefly.
They finished the drink in silence, a rare moment where decades of hatred were set aside for mutual understanding. Norman then stood up, his tired and battered body wrapped in the torn Spider-Man suit. He prepared to leave, returning to the darkness of the night.
Thank you, Jonah, said Norman sincerely. However, he didn't forget his rich man manners. I'm serious about the chair. Just send the bill to me.
Jonah, now sitting relaxed, waved his hand dismissing the offer with his signature style.
I'll keep the chair. It makes for a good story, said Jonah. However, he added with a sly grin, "but I will fleece you on the carpet."
As Norman walked toward the exit, Jonah called him one more time. This time his voice held no sarcasm, only heavy honesty.
Norman?
Norman stopped, mask in hand.
I still don't know if you're a maniac or planning something, Jonah admitted bluntly. But if Peter trusts you...
Jonah stared at the back of the former Green Goblin, giving his final assessment based on what he learned from Peter Parker.
It's because he believes you have the capacity to be a little better today than you were yesterday.
Jonah ended his sentence with a final tone, closing the chapter of their debate that night. That's enough for me. I hope it's enough for you too.
Norman didn't turn back. He stared at the mask in his hand, his face looking sorrowful, absorbing the weight of that hope.
So do I, Jonah, he whispered softly, before disappearing behind the door. So do I. The night was quiet on the city streets. A man walked alone, carrying a bag of groceries, humming softly. He looked like an ordinary man going home for dinner with his family. He was Edward Ned Leeds. Brainwashed, framed, killed, went the narration. Ned had once risen from the dead thanks to a unique compound in his blood, only to be killed again. But now, given a third chance at happiness, the narration continued. Ned walked with a small smile on his face, enjoying this rare normalcy. He promised himself that this time would be different. This time he would hold on to this chance tightly with both hands. He would live peacefully with his wife and child.
Or so he promised himself, the narration wrote, with an ominous tone.
Cruel fate, or in this case, killer technology, didn't care about Ned's life resolutions. As he was about to turn a corner on a quiet street, the reality of the goblin world pulled him back by force. Whoosh! Without warning, a spider slayer, the same hunter robot that attacked Queen Goblin, lunged from the darkness. The robot slammed into Ned's back hard, sending his groceries, milk, canned food, hopes for a quiet dinner, scattering into the air.
But like many people dragged into the goblin world, Ned really didn't have a say in the matter.
While chaos occurred out there with hunter robots attacking the goblins, the atmosphere inside the biotech laboratory of Rand Enterprises seemed quiet, but full of tension. Brian Naring, still wearing his yellow biohazard suit with the gas mask removed, sat slumped in a chair. He blew pink bubblegum, creating a large bubble covering half his face. Pop! The bubble burst, sticking to his nose and lips. Brian cleaned it off indifferently, his mind still bothered by the previous argument with his colleague.
It's not entitlement if you're right, he muttered to himself, justifying his ego.
With a gloved finger, he pressed a button on the control console. Boop! Instantly, the machine in front of him transformed from an empty vessel into a crackling cage of energy. A golden energy network formed, weaving intricate patterns inside the glass tube. This was the result of the Mycoterra experiment and the new fungal strand he had bragged about earlier. Brian's bored face immediately changed. His eyes widened, reflecting the golden light of his experiment. He stared at his handiwork with a mix of religious awe and scientific greed. "Oh, God. Oh, God, yes," he whispered, his breath held. "Come on, baby."
Whatever he had just activated, Brian was sure this was proof of his genius, and perhaps the start of new trouble for everyone.
Brian's enthusiasm reached its peak. He stood up from his chair, screaming in delight seeing the golden energy web holding in the tube.
However, the laws of physics and karma worked fast. The beautiful energy structure was unstable. In the blink of an eye, the golden web exploded from within, sending a shockwave that shattered the containment glass. The explosion hit Brian's face squarely. He groaned as his body was thrown backward by the force of the blast. Smoke filled the room. Brian knelt on the floor, hands covering his now bleeding face. Sounds of groans of pain, glitch, escaped his lips.
Amidst the chaos, the only thing still functioning clearly was the computer monitor nearby. The screen lit up bright red, displaying a cold diagnosis that seemed to mock Brian's earlier arrogance.
The night returned to blanket New York. Norman Osborn, in his battered Spider-Man suit, swung across the city skyline. His body screamed in pain.
I swing through the night, even though my arms are burning and my back is spasming, thought Norman. He realized this was the physical reality Peter Parker always experienced without ever complaining. Without ever discussing it, I know Peter has done this.
However, amidst the physical pain, there was a new mental clarity. The air felt different. The present and future felt clearer.
I may never understand what drives Peter, how he balances the physical and emotional when the stakes are so high, he pondered as he landed on the side of a building.
But I know one thing. I am a little better today than I was yesterday.
He tried to convince himself to make peace with the day. For today, that is enough.
However, that peace was very short-lived. As Norman landed on the balcony or window of his destination, a silhouette waited for him in the darkness. The figure stood on the windowsill, its pitch-black form radiating an aura that was very familiar and terrifying.
Norman!
Norman's eyes widened. His face went deathly pale, filled with pure fear. He recognized that voice, or perhaps he recognized the ghost standing before him. Norman Osborn stood frozen. The sight in front of him wasn't just terrifying, but also a very specific message. Behind them loomed 3 giant Spider Slayer robots. The killing machines stood silent, as if they had finished collecting their collection and were now waiting for the grand prize, Norman Osborn himself. From the pile of bodies, the weak voice of Queen Goblin was heard. She gave a final warning to Norman, making him realize what was actually happening.
They're hunting the goblins, she said, stammering. They're hunting us.
Norman, with the Spider-Man mask in his hand, stared in horror at the reality that even though he tried to be Spider-Man, the world still saw him as a goblin.